We've been looking at the sublime paradox. The sublime paradox of having arrived and yet perpetually becoming. So let's see what happens if we dive deeper. A monk went to the great Zen master Chow Chow and said, "Does the Buddha have worries?" And Chow Chow responded, "Yes." And the monk asked, "But if the Buddha is enlightened, why does he still have worries?" And Chow Chow replied, "It's because you still are not liberated and are in a state of suffering." And the monk replied, "But what if I study carefully and become free of suffering and are liberated? Will the Buddha still have worries?" And Chow Chow responded, "Yes." And the monk said, but if I'm liberated, why does the Buddha still have worries?" Chow Chow replied, "Because all sentient beings are still not liberated." So the monk said, "But it will never happen that all sentient beings are liberated. Does that mean that the Buddha will never be free from worries?" Chow Chow replied, "The Buddha is already free from worries." "But," said the monk, "if all sentient beings are still suffering and are not liberated, how can the Buddha not be free from suffering?" And Chow Chow responded, "The Buddha is free from suffering because in the inner Buddha nature, all beings are already liberated." And then there was a king who was quite enlightened. He realized that the way he presented to the world and life and to his people was what would be reflected back to him. He was kind. He took care of his people, and when he was not able to solve their problems that they came to him with, he would at least listen to them very carefully. But it came the time for him to pass on, and his son, the prince, took over his kingdom. Now, during the king's reign, everything had been prosperous. It was somewhat like a paradise. But when the prince took over, things began to change, because the advisors would come to him and present him with problems that had arisen, such as there being a famine in the land, and the new king would say, "Well, what God rains down on these people is not my business, it's not my problem." Or when they came to say that the dam had burst and villages were flooded, "That's not my problem." So this was the answer that was given every time that anyone came to this new king with some question or something to be solved. And it began to filter down to all the people. They began to not care about one another. They would say, "It's not my problem." There was only one old fisherman who remembered the old king. And so he had a thought. He decided that he would restore his old fishing boat, make it into a yacht. And so he worked, he hammered, he found wood, and he adorned and refurbished his old fishing vessel. And as it took shape, people would pass by and say, "When you get it ready, can we come sailing with you?" And the old fisherman would say, "Yes, you'll all be invited." So finally, after some long while, the fishing boat was transformed into a very beautiful yacht, and an invitation was sent out to all the people to come to go out sailing in this beautiful vessel. Even the king himself had heard about this, and so they gathered, and they went out on the yacht, and they opened their picnic baskets and had a beautiful day. The sun was shining, there was a lovely breeze blowing, and everyone was enjoying themselves. But it was coming on to late afternoon, and people began to say, "Well, is it not time for us to go back into shore now?" And the fisherman said, "Yes, we'll turn the boat around, but before we do so, I have something that I have to do." And he went into his toolbox, and he took out a chisel, and he began to make a hole in the boat. And people came around and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing? If you make a hole in the boat, we're going to sink." And he said, "Well, it's my chisel and my boat. I can do whatever I want." And so he went on with his chiseling, and people got very restless, and so they decided that they'd ask the king to intervene. Well, very pompous young fellow that he was, he came over to the fisherman. He said, "What are you doing?" He said, "What are you doing making a hole in the boat?" And the fisherman just said, "Oh, you're blocking my light. Get out of the way. This is my boat and my chisel. I can do whatever." But the king said, "If you do that, the boat will sink and we'll all drown." "No, well, that's not my problem," said the fisherman. And so the king started to sweat a little bit, and he wasn't quite so pompous as what he was. He began to shake, and his bravado lost him, and he started to beg, "Please, please, 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 we're going to drown. All of us are going to drown." So the fisherman just completely ignored what he was doing. And he just said, "Well, it's not my problem." And all of a sudden the king had an enlightened moment, and he said, "Well, if it's not your problem and we're all going to drown, then it's really everybody's problem because we're all in the boat together." So with this enlightened moment, the fisherman said, "Aha, you have your moment of truth. Let's turn the boat around and go home." But after that, everything changed. The king began to rule, taking care that everyone's needs were fulfilled. And it filtered right down to the people, so that people began to care about people, and so on, and you know the rest of the story. But the question that arises, the first story, we can deeply recognize within ourselves, because in this place of stillness, we recognize that, no, I'm not going to tell you. What is it that we recognize from this being present, intensely present, intensely alert? We know what happens with that, so we can say that we're in touch with that intrinsic inner Buddha nature. We're all beings, all things are already liberated. So we know this, and yet there is this worry of the Buddha, because in the reality of life, in the unfolding of life, everything is becoming. Everything is a process towards liberation. So where do they come together in us? What was it that the monk realized from his interaction with the Zen master Chow Chow? And what does this second story have to do with this solving or reconciling of this sublime paradox of having arrived in the stillness, the intense moments, experiencing that everything has already arrived, and yet, unfolding in time, there's perpetual becoming. What does this second story have to do with this? Where do they meet, these two? The place where everything already is liberated, in the perpetual state of becoming liberated. Where do they meet in us? How do we reconcile? How do we solve this paradox? Or perhaps it can't be solved.
You can see in people, like I've just had experiences over the past few days, and just appointments and things that I've had to go to, and you just